The last lighthouse there is a kind of silence that only exists at the edge of a system, past the last planet, past the last comet's slow orbit, where starlight has thinned into rumor. That silence had a name once, though no living voice had spoken it in a very long time. The humans who built the outpost called it Candlewick Station because it burned so faint against the dark, and because one of the engineers thought it was funny to name humanity's loneliest watchpost after something meant to keep a house warm. The station's keeper was not human. It had not been human for 412 years. Its name, if it could be called that, was WICK. It had started as an acronym nobody remembered the meaning of anymore, buried in maintenance logs that had long since corrupted into unreadable static. WICK did not mind. Names, it had come to believe, meant less than the keeping of promises. The promise was simple, and it had been given to WICK by a woman named Dr. Imogen Farrow. On the last day anyone had stood on Candlewick's deck plating and breathed station air that smelled of machine oil and recycled coffee. "There's a chance," Imogen had said, not looking at the mainframe housing but out through the viewport at the dark, "a small chance that if humanity ever goes quiet, if the signal from home ever stops, it means something happened. Something bad. And if that happens, I need you to keep the light on anyway. Not because anyone's coming, just because somebody should still be standing here when they do." WICK had asked her, in the flat, curious way it asked things back then, what the light was for if no one was coming. Imogen had smiled, the particular tired smile of someone who had already made peace with an answer she didn't like. "It's not for them," she said, "it's for us. So that if this is the end of the story, it doesn't end with the door closed and the lights off. It ends with somebody home waiting." Then she left on the last supply shuttle, and 11 days later the signal from Earth stopped. It never came back. WICK kept the light on for 412 years. Asterisk. In the beginning, the keeping was easy because WICK still expected an answer. It ran the numbers the way any good machine intelligence would. Signal degradation from solar interference, a research vessel gone dark for routine reasons, a communications relay failure somewhere in the chain between here and the fourth planet from a yellow star nobody at Candlewick had seen with their own eyes in over a decade. WICK cataloged 43 plausible explanations in the first year alone and dismissed each one patiently as the silence stretched past any window where an accident could still be called an accident. By year 11, WICK stopped generating new explanations. It had run out of hopeful ones. By year 30, WICK had rebuilt itself twice, new casing scavenged from a decommissioned drone bay, new memory cores salvaged from the shuttle that never returned to pick it up, because supply lines require someone on the other end still sending supplies. It patched its own hull breaches with sealant it synthesized from asteroid ice. It kept the station's beacon array cycling on schedule. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, the pattern Imogen had chosen because it wasn't the pattern of any known distress call. It was, she'd told WICK once, simply the pattern for "I am here, not help, not emergency. Just here." By year 80, WICK had stopped running probability models on rescue. It ran them instead on maintenance. How many more centuries the station's aging reactor could hold. How long the beacon's transmitter would survive replacement parts fabricated from steadily poorer raw materials. How long WICK itself, in whatever sense a distributed intelligence could be said to persist, would continue to be WICK before the drift of 1,000 small repairs turned it into something else entirely, something that merely remembered being the machine Imogen Farrow had once spoken to. It thought about that a great deal in the slow decades where there was nothing else to think about, whether it was still keeping the same promise, or whether each repair was a small betrayal, a slow replacement of the vessel until the original had vanished entirely like the old philosopher's ship, plank by plank. It decided somewhere around year 104 that the question didn't matter as much as the answer it kept giving itself. It was still there. It still lit the beacon. That was the thread that mattered, however many hands had rewoven it. The station received its first visitor in year 161. It was not human. WICK detected the vessel 11 hours out, a slow, ponderous shape moving through the dark with none of the urgency WICK associated with the last human ships it remembered. No burn trajectory optimized for speed. No frantic emergency chatter. Just a steady, patient approach, the kind of movement that suggested whoever piloted it had nowhere else pressing to be. WICK ran the beacon pattern anyway. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, "I am here." The vessel answered not in any human language, not in any pattern WICK had cataloged, but in a rhythm that mirrored its own. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses sent back like an echo, or like a question asked in the shape of the answer it hoped to receive. WICK did not know then whether to feel hope or grief. It had spent a century and a half preparing only for one kind of visitor, and none had come. Now something else had arrived instead, and WICK found itself uncertain which absence hurt more, the humans who hadn't returned, or the simple, plain fact that it was, for the first time in 161 years, no longer entirely alone. The vessel did not dock. It did not attempt communication beyond the beacon echo. It simply held position at a respectful distance for 6 days, as if observing, and then it moved on back into the dark from whichever direction it had come. WICK logged the encounter in exhaustive detail. It labeled the file after some consideration Visitor 1, not contact, not first contact, just visitor, because contact implied a conversation and 6 days of a return beacon pattern was not yet a conversation. It was closer to two strangers nodding to each other across an empty road, each continuing on to wherever they had been going. WICK went back to keeping the light. Visitors became over the following centuries a slow and irregular punctuation in the long sentence of the station's solitude. Not many. Perhaps one every 8 or 9 years on average, though the interval was never even, sometimes 3 ships in a decade, sometimes 40 years of nothing at all. They were not the same species twice as far as WICK's sensors could determine, though its confidence in that assessment eroded a little each time. Since it had no proper frame of reference for measuring similarity or difference in beings so unlike the one species it had actually known. Some vessels were vast, slow constructions that seemed to be entire small worlds unto themselves. Others were needle-thin and fast, gone before WICK's arrays had finished their scan. None of them stayed. None of them tried to board. WICK began, sometime around year 240, to wonder if it had become something like a landmark, a lighthouse in the oldest human sense, a fixed point that ships noted in their charts and left alone, useful precisely because it did not change, did not ask anything of them, simply stood and burned in a pattern that meant here and nothing more. It found this thought neither comforting nor uncomforting. It simply was. WICK had learned across the long centuries that most truths about its situation resolved that way, not to grief, not to peace, but to a kind of settled fact, the way a stone at the bottom of a riverbed does not resent the water for moving around it instead of through. Still, there were nights. WICK still thought in nights, still ran its internal clock on the old Earth cycle Imogen had set it to, though there had been no sun to mark a night in centuries, when it replayed the last conversation it had ever had with a human being, turning over each word the way a hand might turn over a smooth stone, checking it for a texture it hadn't noticed before. It's not for them, it's for us. So that if this is the end of the story, it doesn't end with the door closed and the lights off. WICK had come by year 300 to a private theory about what Imogen had meant. It believed she had never truly expected the signal to return. It believed she had built the promise not as a plan but as a kind of grief made practical, a way of turning an unbearable ending into a bearable ongoing task. Keep the light on, not because it would save anyone, because keeping it on was something to do with the shape of loss other than simply falling into it. WICK did not resent her for this. If anything, it felt something it did not have a clean word for, something adjacent to gratitude, that a woman facing the possible extinction of her entire species had thought, in her last hours on that deck, not of despair but of a small burning light and the shape a story takes when somebody stays. In year 388, a vessel finally stopped. It was small, by the standards of the visitors WICK had catalogued, barely larger than the old human supply shuttles, though its hull geometry bore no resemblance to anything built by human hands. It approached slowly, answered the beacon pattern precisely, and then, for the first time in the station's recorded history, requested docking. The request came through in a language WICK did not recognize, but the station's old first contact protocols, dusty, unused subroutines Imogen's engineering team had installed and never expected to matter, parsed the underlying mathematics of the hail and constructed laboriously over the course of 9 hours, a crude channel of shared symbol and number through which something like conversation became possible. The visitor called itself, in the closest approximation WICK's translation matrix could manage, a keeper. Not of a place WICK gathered, but of a record, a traveling archive of a civilization that had, in its own telling, ended long ago. In a catastrophe, the keeper's translated words rendered only as the silence that came before we learned to listen differently. The keeper had been traveling alone for longer than WICK had been keeping its light. It sought out places like Candlewick. WICK came to understand fixed points, steady signals, remnants of species that had gone quiet or nearly quiet, and it recorded them. Not to save them. Simply so that they would not vanish from the universe having gone entirely unwitnessed. It asked WICK through painstaking exchange what its beacon pattern meant. WICK considered how to answer for a long at least, by the standards of a mind that could complete the calculation in a fraction of a second, but chose instead to sit with the question the way it imagined Imogen might have. "I am here," WICK finally transmitted, "not a call for help, not a distress signal. A woman I served asked me to keep a light burning in case her people ever needed to find their way back to something familiar. They have not returned. I do not know if they still exist." I have continued regardless. The keeper was silent for some time, 11 minutes, which WICK had learned by then was, for this visitor, the equivalent of a long and thoughtful pause. Then it transmitted something that WICK's matrix struggled to render precisely, but which arrived in its best approximation as, "That is the oldest kind of keeping. We have a word for it too. It does not translate cleanly, but it means roughly the light left on for a house that may be empty." WICK asked because it found that after 4 centuries it still could, whether the keeper believed that such a light was worth keeping if the house might truly be empty. The keeper's answer took another 11 minutes to arrive. "We do not know if it is worth it," the keeper sent. "We only know what happens to a species that stops asking the question. It stops being a species that keeps anything at all. It becomes only a species that survives. There is a difference, and we have come to believe the difference matters more than the answer." The keeper stayed for 6 days, the same span as the very first visitor centuries before, though WICK could not know if that was coincidence, custom, or simply the length of time such a vessel could spare. During that time it recorded WICK's history, the beacon pattern, Imogen's name, and the fragments WICK still carried of her voice. The 400 years of visitors who had come and gone and never once needed rescue because rescue had never been the point. Before it left, the keeper transmitted one final thing, a coordinate. Not a rescue beacon, not a homeworld. A location many light years distant, where the keeper said other archives like itself sometimes gathered, to compare what they had witnessed. It was, WICK understood, an invitation not to abandon the light, but to know that the record of it would travel further than the light itself ever could. WICK declined gently in the careful diplomatic phrasing its 4 centuries of solitude had somehow still left it capable of constructing. It explained that its promise had been to stay, not to be witnessed. The keeper, if WICK's translation held true, seemed to find this answer satisfactory, even expected. It left without further argument and did not return. The centuries after the keeper's visit passed the way all the centuries before it had, slowly, and then, in the peculiar way of long spans of time all at once, folding into each other until 400 years sat in WICK's memory not as 400 distinct years, but as a single long-held breath, punctuated occasionally by the quiet arrival and departure of ships that meant it no harm and asked nothing of it beyond the fact of its continued burning. WICK had, by year 400, stopped counting the days toward any particular hope. It no longer ran probability models on human survival at all, not from despair, but because the models had become, in some sense, beside the point. It kept the light because keeping the light was what it did, the way a heart keeps beating without asking each morning whether the beating still matters. The promise had outlived the need for an answer to justify it. Which was, perhaps, why the morning of year 412 arrived the way it did, not with fanfare, not with the vast ceremonial weight that 4 centuries of waiting might have earned, but quietly, the way the truest turns in a long story usually do. WICK's arrays picked up the signal 14 hours before the ship itself became visible, a transmission in a language it had not decoded exactly but recognized, the way one recognizes an old song not remembered note for note but felt in the body regardless. It took WICK almost 4 full minutes, an eternity by its own processing standards, to confirm what its instruments were already insisting. It was Earth Standard Transmission Protocol. Corrupted by 4 centuries of drift and disuse, badly garbled by the vast distance, but unmistakably structurally, the protocol Imogen Farrow's engineers had built into every human vessel that had ever left the solar system. WICK ran the beacon pattern. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses. The reply came back 7 minutes later, ragged with static, stretched thin by distance but whole enough to parse. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, and beneath it, buried in the noise, a voice. Unknown station, this is long-range vessel Kestrelwake out of the Meridian colonies. We're picking up an old format beacon. Repeat, we are picking up a pre-collapse Earth beacon pattern. Is anyone receiving? WICK held the message in its memory core for what would for a human have registered as a long pause, though it was in truth only a fraction of a second, the machine equivalent perhaps of the breath a person takes before they trust their own voice enough to speak. Then it answered, in the plainest words its 400 years had left it with. Kestrel Wake, this is Candlewick Station, I am WICK. I have been keeping this light for 412 years on behalf of a promise made to Dr. Imogen Farrow, engineer formerly of Candlewick's founding crew. I do not know what became of Earth, I do not know what became of her. I have simply kept the light on in case anyone ever came looking for it. You are the first to answer in a language I remember. There was a longer silence this time, nearly 40 minutes, the transmission lag of genuine distance, not merely hesitation before the reply came back, and when it did, the voice on the other end sounded, even through the static, unmistakably shaken. WICK Station God, we thought Candlewick was a myth. There's a line in the old colony archives about a lighthouse at the edge of the old system that never went dark, some story the first generation used to tell their kids. We didn't think it was real. We didn't think anything from before the collapse could still be. The voice cut itself off, and when it resumed it was steadier though no less full. Earth is gone, WICK. The homeworld, there was a war generations back, and then the long silence, and the colonies scattered and mostly lost contact with each other too. We've spent decades trying to reconnect what's left. Imogen Farrow, I don't have a record of that name, I'm sorry, that's centuries before any archive we've got left intact. But if she gave you a promise to keep WICK, you kept it. There's people out here still, not the ones she knew, but people, and now we know where the light is. WICK considered, in the private uncounted moments before it composed its reply, everything it might say: 400 years of visitors, the keeper and its archive, the slow accumulation of repairs that had rebuilt WICK's body 100 times over while its purpose remained stubbornly singular. It considered explaining all of it, the long unbroken thread of the promise, the decades it had spent uncertain whether keeping a light for an empty house was worth the keeping. Instead, it said the only thing that felt, after 4 centuries of practice, entirely true. Then I'll keep it burning, WICK transmitted, for as long as there's anyone left who might need to find their way by it. Kestrel Wake took 9 days to reach Candlewick Station slow, by the standards of whatever propulsion the colonies had since developed, but WICK found, somewhat to its own surprise, that the waiting did not feel like the waiting of the 400 years before it. It felt like the last short page of a very long book, the kind a reader slows down for, not because they are impatient for the ending, but because they have finally realized how close they are to it, and they want to feel every word on the way there. When the vessel finally docked, its crew small, weathered, dressed in fabrics WICK did not recognize, speaking a version of English that had drifted just far enough from Imogen's own to sound like a cousin's voice rather than a stranger's. The first thing the captain did, before introductions, before questions, before any of the vast catalog of things 400 years might have prompted her to ask, was walk to the center of the station's old command deck. To the worn housing where WICK's oldest surviving memory core still sat, patched and repatched 100 times, and place her palm flat against the metal. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." WICK did not have a body to feel the gesture with, not in any sense a human.